Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Tongson, and it's my pleasure to host this installment of Freedom U, part of the programming leading up to ASA 2022. And we have the honor today of talking about the notorious CFP. The roof is on fire. And I think, we all had very variegated experiences as the world began to, or the academic world, the scholarly world began to respond to the lyrical CFP, the genre-breaking CFP that was released for this year's gathering in New Orleans. And so we're here today. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and we're going to touch on a few topics and chat casually and kind of off the cuff about what we thought about the whole kerfuffle, as well as what we think about the CFP itself. So Marisol, you want to get us started?
Hey everyone, I'm Marisol Lebron. I'm an associate professor of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. And my research is on policing in Puerto Rico and in Latinx communities.
Dale.
Hey everyone, my name is Dale Gore. I'm associate professor in the African American Studies Department at Georgetown University. My research is mostly on African American politics and African diaspora. I look at sort of Black women's radicalism and political thought.
Yamara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yamaira Figueroa Vasquez, and I'm an associate professor of global Afro-diaspora studies at Michigan State University in the Department of English. And I work in Black Latinidad, the Black Atlantic diasporas, and comparative ethnic studies.
And Pablo, who's coming at us from the road.
Hey everyone, I'm Pablo Jose Lopez Soto. I'm an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Smith College. I work on Black Indigenous community in New York City by the name of Garifuna from Central America's Caribbean coast, particularly looking at oral histories, public performances, and visual cultures on their negotiations around their Blackness, indigeneity, and Latinidad. Happy to be here.
Great. And as I mentioned up top, I'm Karen Tongson. I'm chair of the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Southern California, where I also direct the Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture. And much of my work focuses actually on popular and public cultures, including popular music, which I think is one of the activating points of this year's CFP for ASA, with its reference to the roof is on fire. And I think just as a way of getting started, I'd like to ask each of you to say what your reactions were initially to receiving that CFP and reading the CFP. Who wants to go first?
So I can start, which was, I feel like I saw some of the pushback of the CFP before I even saw CFP. So it's like, I have a kid now, and so I'm slow to email, but I'm on Twitter often. So I feel like I saw a lot of the pushback to CFP, and it was kind of like, what is going on? And then finally got to see the CFP, and I love the CFP. I thought it was really awesome, and I thought it was very Shauna, and was really spoke to, I think, the breadth and the depth of her thinking and her engagement with Black popular culture and social movements. And so to me, when I saw the CFP, I was like, this makes a lot of sense, and was really kind of confused by some of the backlash. And, as I was scrolling through what was happening on social media, it became very apparent to me, one, that a lot of the folks who were, I think, some of the most vocal and critique, and, I got picked up by like right-wing trolls, but not even those folks, right? But like people who would ostensibly be in the orbit, if we want to call it that, were folks that were really disconnected. And I think folks that probably didn't even know who the president of ASA was, and didn't know Shauna, and that made I think the assumption that the person that had written the CFP was a white dude, right? And so, you know, I saw a lot of stuff about like, this is so like performative and cringy and all of this kind of stuff. And there, I think, was an underlying assumption that the person who was writing this could not be who she was, right? And in a position of leadership. And I think that was really telling to me in terms of seeing some of the critique was this kind of assumption of who's in these leadership positions and who the organization is for and who the organization represents, which I think have been, at least in my experience, having been on National Council and the executive committee of ASA, are debates that have shaped, I think, the organization over the past decade, if not, I mean, obviously have shaped the organization always, right? But especially intensified, I think, whose ASA is it, right, over the past decade.
Yeah, who else would like to chime in here? Dale.
So I had the opposite experience in the sense that I am on Twitter, but my Twitter is quite dormant. I'm a snooper on Twitter, and that's about it. So I had read the CFP. I think I received it through some media form, and I'd read it, and I really just was blown away by it. I thought, too, it was very much Shauna. It was what I think we would want a president to do, to put their stamp on a call, right? To speak to sort of their strengths around a scholar who works on sort of Black music, musicology, social movements, protests, right? And I just thought it conveyed that in its sort of strongest fashion. But I also thought it did a little more than that, or much more than that. For me, it really resonated with the moment. And I just thought the difficulty of coming out of a pandemic, coming out of the uprisings, coming out of 4 years of sort of and a growing white nationalism, and trying to think about what you do for the first coming together in New Orleans, because I know, like most people, I'm hyped to go to New Orleans, right? I love that city, but it also resonates with you, the struggles that happen in urban centers in the South, the struggles around climate, all of these things that resonate in this moment as we're facing 2022. I just thought that piece captured it. It captured the need for understanding the struggle we've been in and the real both personal and political ways it's impacted us. I thought it captured the need for critique and the possibilities in this moment of challenging, like doing something with this moment and making it opening up new possibilities for us. But I also thought it did something that we really needed was joy, right? That in these moments of struggle and politics, the thing is, I'm a scholar of social movements, that these movements that sustain people are movements that have both the struggle, the politics, the strategy, but also joy, a sense of community, even if it's fleeting, even if the person that you're going to be arguing with in 10 minutes, that in a chant you feel this togetherness. And I just thought that invoking of the roof is on fire with both a moment of crisis, right? Thinking about the long histories of the 80s that it invokes in that moment, but also I really thought it did something about that moment of joy when you're in a club and everybody knows the song and you're just like, oh, at this one moment we're all together in it. You know, it really resonated with me that moment. I've been listening to that song, I'm dating myself now, and had that moment where we're all like, the roof is on fire, you know, and I just thought, that moment in protest, that moment in sort of despair where you have this sense of a belonging, I really thought it captured. And I thought that was important and powerful. So I was really moved by it, and it resonated with me both on the personal and I think on an intellectual and political level.
And that line actually that I want to bring in after your comments, Deo, I think it's in the middle of the CFP, the roof, you know the rest, or you should. Right. And I think that's sort of wonderful, the invocation or the call to sing along. And if you don't know how to do that, you know, it's not that it's exclusionary, but you should understand at the very least the kind of message it's imparting around both crisis, but also the capacity for joy in crisis. Pablo and Yomaira. Mm-hmm.
For sure. Yeah, I wanted to kind of echo the sentiments of my two colleagues. I think, like Marisol, I saw it first, the reactions on Twitter before I saw my email. And I was like, what is going on, right? Like, what is academic Twitter, a small subset, obviously, of the entire user group of it? What has got everybody in a huff? Because one of the things that I saw was a broad range of reactions. Well, actually, kind of like a binary. I saw folks saying like, oh, this is the dopest thing I've seen in a long time. I'm so excited. And then the other half, which was like, this is so cringy. This is so corny. Like, who these people think they are, right? Like all of these kinds of ways in which the call was dismissed outright, right? Without a serious engagement in what it was asking us to do, which was to think differently and engage differently. And in that way, I think what was really clear is that the leadership that Shauna is bringing to the table was reflected in the call for papers in a way that I think we want to see in our kind of associations. We want to see this at ASA, at MLA, at all the other conferences. We'd love to see the people that we elect into these leadership positions put their spin on what that is, especially when it's so resonant with the moment that we're living in, right? And not only that, and I love the kind of thinking about the moments. And I'm thinking about all these small moments that I've ever had at ASA, at some of the parties, at some of the conference, at some of the panels, but mostly at the parties, right? Where you are feeling like so in groove and so connected with so many other folks and academics and community members and other folks who are there, and how that doesn't actually have to be just those small moments like late night, but that it could be the spirit of the conference as a whole. Seemed to be really exciting. And honestly, one of the things that we should also think about is like where ASA has gone in the past like decade. Like if we were part of the association 10, 20 years ago, this is a very different constituency. It's a very different place. Whether some of the old guard likes it or not, it really has shifted. And I think it has done so in exciting new ways. And we still have way more to go to really reflect what American studies really is and could be. But this call for papers, it's experimental and like both thoughtful, exciting, and a bit humorous, right? Like there are moments where like it's a heavy content, but we can laugh and we can be in on a joke together or invited to be in on this together, right? Be in on this kind of spirit of the roof is on fire, right? Let it burn. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see how people were activated when reading, right? The call for papers and also reading each other's tweets. And I think there's a lot more to be said about like what kinds of tweets incited more engagement. And also folks who were not even part of the conversation, who had never even read the call for paper, already, we could see the kinds of knee-jerk reactions that folks were having to it. At the same time, I was really excited to see the way that it was being embraced, right, by a whole slew of folks. And, I think we will see at the conference what that could look like. Nothing is perfect, right? It's not saying like this is going to be the ultimate liberatory moment forever and always. But the fact of the matter is that it's like in these small ruptures that we are trying to create interrelationality with each other across and within the kinds of the lives that we're living, right?
Pablo, is it safe for you to chime in while you're driving?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I definitely echo everyone's reactions and really resonate around this idea of like querying the genre of the call for papers. For me, it was just so inviting in a way that it modeled for me the possibilities of a different kind of American studies. And I think as someone whose work is in American studies, but not of American studies, I've always had an impression that American studies in its very kind of slash interdisciplinary slash multidisciplinary way was pretty conservative in certain aspects. And this really just, I mean, literally this call for papers just ruptured, right? The formalities and I think the even the respectability politics that come along with the call for paper in the sense, right? So seeing people's reactions was really interesting. And it was so important to even see the work of Black study in the language, in the rhetoric, in a moment where Black study is in perpetual state of emergency in terms of institution, but also in such a freshness of a future.
Well, and speaking of disciplinarity or lack thereof, I did kind of want to invoke a few more lines from the CFP to continue our conversation here. And it's the paragraph that begins, "This year's theme is an homage to the cultures and knowledges too often dismissed or taken, those pieces that prove that our minds and hearts are optimized by laboring in tandem. It is a reminder, if needed, that we come from somewhere, from some people, and they are always reinventing, subtly and not so subtly, the terms of our engagements and relation." And I do think that that particular passage strikes at the heart of certain disciplinary entrenchments that happened in response to the CFP. And I'm just going to name it outright here. And it's because, like, when I was on Twitter, I found myself embroiled in a lot of engagements, particularly with folks from, the kind of disciplinary vestiges and training of my past, those folks in literary studies who, and of a particularly pasty vintage of literary studies that invoked the phrase cringe or what have you, and in a particularly kind of also a particular stylistic, it wasn't even so much old guard lit folks who went after it, but actually what I would say is a kind of younger, some very maybe Marxist identified, not, but in a particular kind of almost, I like to use the phrase Neiman Marxist identified way of understanding the world. And with a particular, I think, some with grievances against the academy for, I don't know, perhaps maybe not valuing some of their more disciplined or more disciplinarily rooted contributions, and policing the style of the CFP. In fact, in many ways, actually kind of creating what were very apparent taste divides and certain kind of inscribing a form of cultural capital on the reception of the CFP that I found really offensive. Many of those tweets got taken down. I saved a few of them, but I saved a few of them, perhaps with a reference to vomiting out the window in the middle of the night or something like that. But I'm here to say, and I'm here to bear witness to the fact that we did bear witness to that response, to that reaction. We cannot sweep it under the rug once people sorted out who wrote it, once people sorted out what the actual politics of ASA are and have been. And so, I guess I do want to invite the discussion around disciplinarity, around entrenchments in response to the CFP, and the complaints about style as an extension of certain political or ideological conflicts and positionalities in the academy, because I do feel that there was a kind of pile on, and that there were people who had to kind of speak from between these different ASA communities and some of these other communities to either, renounce or accept the CFP. And sometimes the silence was also very telling. I don't know. I know that I'm just speaking openly and very candidly about it, but I think it's worth marking that kind of eruption. Anybody else want to chime in here right away?
I mean, I guess I'll say something that's both builds on a point that Pablo made in this point, because I do think one of the central things that comes under attack is centering Black study. Mm-hmm. And I really felt like in this piece, saw a couple Twitters, and one of them was making fun of the idea of a juke joint, and just the ways in which the dismissing of a knowledge that was not familiar to them, right? That I thought really spoke to the ways in which, even with all the rhetoric and discussions that happen among not the conservative, but more liberal Neiman Marxists, we might just go with Neiman Marcus politics, and maybe get a brand, but I just think some of that really speaks to the ways in which how resistant people are to actually giving voice to a sort of intellectual project that centers those that have been so marginalized before. And I think that very line that you read from poem, the sort of knowledges that aren't acknowledged or are taken, right, is the very practice of how the only acceptable way I think that Black study gets into the academy, right? It's either taken or it's marginalized as sort of secondary, not central. And I do think that one of the things the call did, I think it broadly invokes a whole bunch of knowledge. It's not just Black studies. Like, I think it is an opening, but it emerges from that. You can't deny the roof is on fire, those frameworks that center it, but I think it opens a more capacious understanding of the we that's being invoked there. But it is telling that those certain people felt themselves called into that we, and certain people felt themselves excluded from that we, and not in a way, and this is a point that I think I've been really trying to think through, not in a way where you feel embarrassed about your lack of knowledge, but you feel empowered with your lack of knowledge. And I think that is something that speaks to me around sort of the frameworks of anti-Blackness and white supremacy at work, that I'm not embarrassed at this academic study. I don't know. I'm not going to try and go find out, but I'm just going to make fun, because what could they be invoking that I don't know? And I just think that's a really telling moment that happened in this sort of responses to the call.
Yeah, the failure to ascribe value. I love that point, because so much of academia in general is about creating structures of shame around a lack of knowledge. And yet, when confronted perhaps with the lack of referential knowledge, even to, Rockmaster Scott and the Dynamic Three, that instead, I guess, produced a certain kind of entrenchments, or even, as you were saying, that kind of white supremacist toggle into aggrievement and an unwillingness to know what they don't know, and instead, sort of insisting that what is unknown lacks value. Who else would like to chime in this regard?
I mean, I just want to say that, it's the kind of lack of awareness is then seen as a threat rather than an invitation to know more, right? And so I think that that's precisely the feeling that you get. It's like I want to say some bro, but like some people, a series of different bodied peoples felt a particular kind of way, right? But I think, it's so easy to get caught up. I think definitely for me as a teacher as well, to get caught up in the person who's like not getting the material, the person who's not buying it, the person who's like refusing to engage. It's so easy to like hyper focus on that. But the reality is, as I was like revisiting the post, that there was so much outpouring of like love for the call for papers. There was so much like positive engagement with it and excitement, and folks thinking about like, wow, like Black life, Black joy can be a site for potential thinking at an organization like the ASA. How exciting. And so I think that's also like worthy of like the conversation and its notoriousness, right? Because it became kind of like this kind of call for folks who are like, oh, I'm definitely going to apply. I'm definitely going to try to go. This is really an incredible moment to be able to be marked, even as we see all of these kinds of folks like deeply entrenched in their kind of like desire to keep the ASA as, I don't even know, like, I don't know what it is that folks want. Do they want it? I'm not even going to fake as if I know the desire of folks who hated on the CFP. Like, what is it that you would like to see instead of this? Some like dry toast, type of call for paper, like you may submit 200 words on American culture, preferably, white or something. I have no idea. So, but I think that it's important for us to also see the kinds of ways that it challenged even those of us who are doing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, to like even open our minds and see the possibility, like, oh shit, like this is now opened up for us. What can I possibly do, say, offer in this arena?
If I could jump in, just because, and Yomaira can also speak to this, like I think that question of the way that the CFP opened things up for us, and as an invitation, I'm part of another organization, the Puerto Rican Studies Association, which Yomaida is also on the executive committee for. And for us, it was interesting because we were just starting the process of drafting our CFP. And we saw what was happening with the ASA CFP, and we were like, bet, all right, that's what we're doing. And we were like so inspired by, I think, the experimental tone, but also going to Deo and Yomaida's point, the centering of Black knowledge, right? And ways of knowing and joy. And, you know, that became for us then a major component of crafting the CFP and bringing that to the center of our conference, right? And thinking, you know, so our conference ended up being called Morivivi, Activating Puerto Rican Futures. And for us, we were like, if we were going to imagine and activate a Puerto Rican future, then Black ways of knowing and the knowledge produced by Black women, queer Black folks, right? That needs to be at the center. And that's something that's clear from the CFP, right? The CFP has a very obvious engagement with Black studies, right? But it's also queer, it's feminist, it's all of that stuff too, right? And so really centering those ways of knowing and being and thinking about alternatives and futurity for us in Puerto Rican studies was almost like a call to arms, right? Where we were like, we want to take this up too, right? And this is something that's important to us too. And I think that, you know, so as much as people tried to, I think, shut down the CFP, I think that point that Dale and Yomaida bring up, that it did activate stuff for people. It did create a kind of call in or a sense of community for folks that even if you are not, you know, 100% positive of all of the references in it or whatever, right? There was a sense where the potential, right? And I think the urgency of the call in trying to say what kind of world do we want to live in broadly, but also what kind of ASA do we want to be, right? And who are we centering? That urgency, I think, activated a lot of people. The other thing I wanted to say, though, around the question related to this is that, you know, and this goes to, I think, something that Deo said, right, is that there's a we. I mean, and Shauna writes it with a we, right, throughout the CFP. And I think that that's part of what called some people in and made some other people felt like called out, right? And so that sense where if you see that we and you don't immediately identify with it, you're feeling some kind of way and pushing back, right? And then it's cringe, and then it's unserious, it's frivolous, it's all of this kind of stuff. And so, you know, I think that kind of sense of we and who gets centered is also at kind of the core of some of these reactions. But, you know, Karen, you asked about like disciplinarity, and you were like, I don't know what these people want. And I was like, I know what these people want. They want material culture without the culture, right? But no, I mean, I think there's these moments, you know, I think about the ASA boycott vote, you know, many moons ago now, although it's still obviously a very present part of what's going on in the ASA, where so many of the reactions in that moment, you know, I think this is another moment like that, where you kind of see these struggles over what does American studies mean, right? And, you know, during the BDS vote, which I think also became apparent and like repeated, we got like echoes of it during this, is this kind of, oh, wither ASA, my God, the ethnic studies people are taking over, right? And the Black studies people are taking over. And that's not just about, you know, people feeling like, you know, the membership is becoming, you know, more Black, more brown, more queer, more whatever, but it's also about that question of what knowledge is getting centered as central to American studies and the work that we do and the work that the organization prioritizes, right? And this feeling that if you want to, you know, I'll borrow from my partner, makes this joke all the time where she's like, you know, people want to study postcards and don't want to talk about colonialism, right? Like that kind of decentering of many of the themes that I think the CFP is asking us to really take seriously around questions of colonialism and violence and racism, but also of joy and struggle and culture as nurturing, right? And all of those things that the CFP is trying to get us to think about, which is central to the project of ethnic studies and Black studies, right? And that kind of debate about, or is American studies part of that or not, right? And that kind of struggle that I think is really, I think a debate that is really tense among the membership in ways that aren't necessarily always apparent until things like this happen.
Pablo, did you want to get in here while we're on this topic?
Absolutely. I was thinking along the lines, the conversation and the question made me think about geography a lot. I think it's really important that New Orleans is the place where the call for papers queerly centers Black life, Black study, particularly both in an intellectual but also personal note, right? Because of New Orleans and not only because what it has been hemispherically for the Black Atlantic world, but also it's literally the first point of entry for Garifuna folks. And it's very much a place where Black Central America's Caribbean coast has been very present for centuries. And I think for me in particular, when I think about New Orleans as this Black global South space, the call just becomes so much more alive, and these disciplinary boundaries make no sense. They literally just make no sense to be able to capture the nuances and the complexities. Like I'm literally going back to the call, and it's about multi-sensory. It's about multiple archives, multiple locations, right? You don't have to say diaspora, but diaspora is really present in the call, right? It's not one that is deeply bounded to the nation state, right? So it's a really exciting, I think for me, the question about disciplines or interdisciplinarity really leads me back to New Orleans, like leads me back to the geography of New Orleans in the Black Atlantic world, right? And in the Black Americas that we live in.
Thank you, Pablo. I do really love that phrase, material culture without the culture. I think that's a tremendous and very precise way of accounting for it. But I also want to take off from where Pablo left off around location. And I actually want to allow us to entertain some of the critiques that may have been, I don't know, at least incisive or legitimate around the question of having conferences and the question of what it does to locations and to places. And I think we've all many of us here have very recently organized conferences. I just co-organized ASAP with a large group of people, the Association for Studies of the Arts of the Present in Los Angeles. And we had written our CFP right before the ASA CFP dropped in. And it was interesting to see the resonances around breaking form, about breaking convention, literally breaking the convention apart in different ways and trying to think differently about what constitutes a gathering in the pandemic world, right? Because there were some of the material critiques about at least the conference extend to other ASA as a conference extend to some of the ones circulating around conferences around, okay, well, what is it? And around also academic privilege and who that privilege is attached to. I think it's interesting that academic privilege is questioned when you have leadership that is non-white, when you have a voice in the CFP that is not centered in that particular way. But I wanted to ask some of those questions about, what it means for us, or in what ways can we think about, the engagement with the location, and our engagement with locations as scholars who do these conventions in these places, and what is foremost in our mind, and maybe how the CFP addresses those issues or maybe doesn't.
So if I could jump in, because I want to say something about this, because I think that there were a lot of really legitimate critiques of conferences and of the way that eliteness is reproduced in the academy that got really mixed up in all of this other whack stuff with the CFP, right? And so, I think that there was a lot of, I think valid and pointed questions coming, particularly from like contingent folks about like, what does it mean to, be able to talk about these issues from, a place of incredible institutional support and backing, right? Who gets to participate in those conversations? What does it mean to be centering discussions of climate change when we know that we're about to have hundreds of people flying from all over the country with a massive carbon footprint, right? So, I think that there were a lot of critiques that people were asking. They were really valid, that were brought up by the CFP and its focus on questions of climate change and precarity, which, I think are issues that the ASA is working to address, right? But they got drowned out or subsumed by, I think, these other kind of critiques of the CFP, which were about form and questions of what kind of knowledge gets centered and all of that other kind of stuff that we lost those kind of questions, and I do think that they're important for us to think about from a centering of contingent folks and centering of non-academic voices and knowledge, right? So like the fact that we're drawing a lot from non-academic, non-formal academic ways of knowing, right? When the space is in many ways closed off to those folks who are practitioners, right? Or whatever, right? And so, I think that that's an important thing for us to think about. I also saw like people saying like, it's cool to be thinking with New Orleans at the same, but it's not cool when you're also coming and doing the whole tourist thing and engaging in kind of the reproduction of these extractive kind of economies, and which is something that I'm really sympathetic to. I had lots of opinions and feelings when ASA was in Puerto Rico, and when it's now this going back to Puerto Rico, right? Really complicated kind of feelings about supposedly learning from the place, and then people just hanging out by the pool and having pina coladas, right? And you can see the same kind of concerns, I think, about New Orleans as a spot, right, for the conference. So I do think that there were critiques of which were pointed at the CFP that are not about the CFP, but that are about actual questions of how elite privilege, even among minoritized people, right, are reproduced, right, through these academic associations and through these spaces that are actually, if we want to, I think, be the kind of organization that the CFP is calling us to and that we say we want to be, we have to take those kind of critiques really seriously.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I think just really briefly, I wanted to say that the what became really clear was that there was a sense of like questions around the ethics of conferencing, in the contemporary like political and ecological climate that we are in, and also like the health crisis, right, that we're facing, and in places that are places like New Orleans, places like Puerto Rico, right, places that are kinds of outpost colonies, right, in the U.S. context. So there's all of this kind of sense of these like critiques around like what are the ethical implications? What should we be doing? How can we think about this differently? How can we do this better? And I think that all kind of got subsumed and became fodder for like, how dare these people come up with this like call for papers, right? And also, can you believe they're having the conference at a hotel of all places, right? Like, and so it just got so reductive, and then it just became in this way. There was I guess that kind of really incisive critique then just was reduced by people in bad faith, right? To be like, and conferences should all go to hell in a handbasket because they're just, we're all destroying the planet, right? And that in that way, one of the things that I feel that happens and happens all too often is that we begin to like argue with each other at the bottom, right? Without actually looking at the kind of structures that we're in. And so we then actually just continue to have these kinds of bad faith engagements that don't get us to a real place of interrelationality around the kind of ethical question that that has been posed and that we're all thinking about as we're going to these conferences. The other part of it is kind of like it becomes when we're not having that conversation in good faith, when we're actually not trying to parse out what's happening and how we can actually act better with one another and in relation to our work, our communities, our colleagues, right? Like across the board, then it becomes really meta, right? So it's like, why do we have to meet in the first place? Why do we have to do any of this work in the first place? What does it all matter, right? Like, and then it just like waters it down, and it's like, and so then, and as the result, you know, professors shouldn't exist, and neither should university. And like, it becomes this kind of thing. It's like, well, if you're gonna say this, and you can say this and this and this and that, right? And again, that is like the part of it that is like Twitter is not a place for these kinds of like exchanges to flourish in any way that is useful, right? It's like a useless place to argue oftentimes because there's such bad faith engagement. So I just wanted to say that, like, I'm 100% agree with you, Marisol, that there's all of these ways for us to kind of take up and think differently about what we could do with ASA. But what was happening was not. That conversation really got silenced, and it just became this other thing completely, where it really just, at the bottom of it, people were like, we should never meet again. We should only meet on Zoom. But also, like, where's this, material being stored anyway, right? Like, it just is like all of that kind of thing. Where are the server spaces kind of thing? And so there is, I think even part of the call for paper calls attention to these moments, these tensions, and this realization is like, there is potentially no way out of this bind in this moment, right? Like, and so how do we make things work in the place that we're in as we're envisioning a new and different kind of world that we want to be in? So I don't know, I would say that.
I love the point you make, because I do think, and I think several folks have made it around a number of points. One, if any place the conversation could happen among academic conferences, and I speak from someone who's disciplinarily trained as a historian, so do go to huge historian conferences that rarely think about labor, much less sort of the implications of what conferencing is, or how do you bring in people who have different access to resources, abilities, all of these other things that I think the call for papers tries to take up. I found it hard to even engage those because it got wrapped up in these other questions. And I think they are profound and important. They expose the ways in our urban centers, so much of them are built on this tourist economy, and the working poor, Black and brown people both live and die by them. And I think that is probably the conundrum right there, right? That you both could mobilize a call for conferences that helps the working poor, right? Their urban centers are taken over by these convention centers, and if not one, two, and hotels, and this is the way you make resources, at the same time that it is basically destroying their housing ability to leave, the environment, all these other things. And I just feel like that is such a conundrum of capitalism that really makes these moments so fraught, I think, and even trying to be attentive to it, right, as academics, that how do you negotiate that, right? Because I can remember doing conferences where there are both calls for people to come, and most of my conferences aren't fun, they're like in Detroit or Pittsburgh, right, but calls for people to come at the same time that there is resistance. Or someone was just telling me about in the UCs this idea that you would not travel to the South where there have these anti-queer, anti-trans policies, which also produces a lack of solidarity with those spaces at the same time. So I think it becomes really a complicated conversation about what you do in these moments. How do you build solidarity? And some of that is, to me, starts with building collective sort of unity as the cost, laboring together. And I just felt like that's such a hard conversation to have in the midst of these attacks. And I really would, in any activist space, that one of the things we really have to practice is figuring out how to create spaces to have the conversations that are about moving us forward, and not, I think, as was mentioned, not sort of get wrapped up in these disingenuous conversations where people take it up as another sort of club against to support their own interventions. And so I think those are conversations worth having. I think they are important. I think they are complicated as hell, and really to have the righteous politics, there is no path towards that. So we have to have the most strategic, and I think the ones that emerge out of solidarity. But I just think those are conversations worth having, but obviously not on Twitter, and maybe not as the CFP is coming out.
And to be fair, the shell game of the kind of stylistic critique of the CFP, as many of you pointed out, basically diverted eyes away from the nuts and bolts part of the CFP, which is on the bottom, which actually begins to try to address some of these issues and asks about a kind of restructuring or a kind of structural reimagining of gathering and of how we compile and put things together. Pablo, did you want to add something to this thread before we begin with our final topic?
Not really, but a lot of things that sometimes I think a lot about these conversations, and like to echo what Marisol was bringing up around like these ideas around academics and elitist spaces and things like that. I mean, I saw a lot on Twitter around not being able to afford to attend the conference still, right? Like I saw a lot of folks, I mean, and I'm talking about first gen, faculty of color, talking about I can't upfront the bill. And low key, I'm on that list myself, right? Because it's still really expensive because of lodging and all of that stuff. So these conversations are so multi-layered, right? And yeah.
Could I just say something real quick before
All of us unmuted at once.
We're like, that's a relatable problem. But no,
Love
I mean, but I just want to say, because I think, there was something you said that's really important, and that we have been discussing in the EC is like, we're now having to contend with it. It's like conferences are already so unaffordable. Like if you're in any kind of precarious position, if you're a grad student, like I'm still paying off debt from going to ASAs as a grad student. Like I'm going to probably have that debt till I die at this point, right? Like, and so it's real, right? This kind of pay for play model of academia that conferences are part of, right? That as much as they're generative, amazing spaces, they're part of these structural inequalities. But this point, I think, Karen, I think you said it, is that the structural elements of it get lost, and it gets targeted towards the association or towards like elite academics or whatever. But there's lots of things that ASA has to contend with that are completely out of its control. Like right now, the California travel ban, and Dale, this is what you were kind of talking about, right? So like California scholars right now cannot use state funds to travel to the South. Essentially the South is blockaded for people from California, which is about like supposedly protecting queer and trans rights, as if there's no queer and trans people, right? And it's about cutting off solidarity, right? Cutting off connection in the name of this kind of whatever version of liberalism, right? But this is another thing that's a structural barrier to participation that the ASA has to figure out how to contend with, right? And that I think there's a lot of anger over that is part of this larger inaccessibility of these conferences to begin with. And then there's these, travel bans or state funding cuts or whatever that complicate that, right? And they get seen as something that is endemic to the association or conferences, as opposed to larger critiques that we should be making about cuts to education, right? Cuts that target the South. And as our colleague Sharon Holland pointed out, right, there's the largest population of Black folks in the country that you've essentially said you can't travel to, right? That's about precisely cutting off meaningful solidarity in the name of this kind of performative solidarity, right? That are exactly the kind of things that we should be talking about and really reckoning with. How do we deal with that? And I think, the stuff that the ASA can do is like a bullet or a Band-Aid over a bullet wound in some ways, right? The solidarity fund, that's the best that the association can do to respond to those kind of things, right? And it's not enough, right? But I think there's a kind of way in which the organization seems like not doing what it should be doing, that doesn't take seriously the fact that the association has to do stuff because of all of these other kind of structural problems that it's in a responsive kind of role to.
Were you going to chime in a little bit more, Deo, or?
I mean, I just was gonna say, I really, Pablo's point, I really resonate with. And some of that is about the work we have to do in the university itself, right? Even as an elitist institution, many folks come in without the funds. I know when I started, to be real, like even at my second and third jobs, that you would have to front the money. And I was like, unless you're gonna make sure it goes on my credit card right away, I don't really know what you're asking me to do to be able to just pay it out of pocket. The assumptions that come along with this, that I think you then are shamed into, or supposedly your success is supposed to make this viable when no one's paying you enough to actually be able to do these things, I think is a real question around conferences more broadly. Yeah, and it's real. I when I was starting out, we had a real struggle around them starting to give money up front, because many of us could not afford to even, they were like, this is your money. And it was like, it is totally inaccessible to us if we have to pay everything up front. And I feel like those questions always need to be put on the table. So some of that is about pushing those questions, even not just in not just in conferences, but in our own institutions and other spaces that we inhabit.
Yeah.
I just want to chime in and say that I agree, and that one of the things, you know, that especially for those of us who are first generation, you know, scholars, right? Like, we are coming into this with very little to no safety net, and so as a result, we are incurring lots of debt, which actually then impacts us as we go through, right? So there are many ways that we will never reach, right, the same kinds of security, financial security and otherwise, that some of our colleagues who don't have these kinds of worries about, like, should I go to this conference? Should I present my work? Should I share it and pay $2,000 that I don't have, and then have 29% interest on this for who knows how long I'm going to pay this, right? Like, it just incurs. But I think the other part of it is, like, this is a constant conversation. And for me, like, where you can miss me is with the disingenuousness with which people then use the call for papers or the ASA or Black leadership in the ASA and say, like, not only do I think your call for papers is bullshit, but y'all are, like, not critical enough. And then also, we can't even go. And so y'all are fucked up from top to bottom, right? So there's a way that then that gets hurled then back into it, as another way to kind of delegitimize, right? The kinds of movidas that are being made within these organizations by first gen scholars, by Black scholars, by folks who are actually trying to make some shifts, right? Make some ruptures within primarily very elitist institutions and organizations. So, this is a critique that has to, like, stay constant all the time. But for me, I'm always very, very alert at when it's coming, from who and at who, right?
Yeah. And welcome back, Dale. You made it just in time.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I take it off.
you were put from the space. Yeah, and I do just recall the sheer terror of ever having to host even faculty who are visiting campus and having to be the one to take them out to dinner when I didn't have a credit card as an assistant professor because I wasn't allowed to, because I was dealing with debt from graduate school. In any case, I love that this conversation, made its way to some of these important points and critiques and these conversations that have to continue and to evolve as we move forward, even from this gathering. And I guess by way of concluding, I just want to invite revisiting some of the more utopian and euphoric registers of the CFP, and asking each of you perhaps what you look most forward to as we look forward to the conference next week, as we actually, at the time of taping, it's next week, but the conference will begin just a couple of days after I think this session is aired. What utopian energy or perhaps confrontational energy, or, will you be bringing to this gathering when we get there? And it can be, you talk about like who you're working with, what kind of connections you hope to forge or make, and also where you may have gone with the CFP and in your participation this year. Pablo, are you there? Okay.
I'm happy to jump in first because I was very excited by the CFP when I first read it and was like, oh, I'll go. But I ended up just volunteering to chair a panel. I wanted to sort of contribute in some other ways. I had some other committee stuff, and frankly, I'm excited about the opportunity to gather again. This will be my first conference post-pandemic. I haven't actually attended one yet, and I'm excited about the sort of innovations in presentation. I'm very invested in intellectual community. That is sort of where my activist roots get activated into academia, and I really was impressed in general by the ASA's efforts. I think multi-year efforts to create new spaces for new ways of having conversation. And so I'm excited about some of the sort of multiple sessions where people pre-circulate papers, where there's like reading groups where you've agreed to read a certain set of work. I love the frameworks where people talk about an author, or like author meets critic kind of framework. So I'm excited about some of those more innovative and thinking about other ways of doing it, even the ones that might think about how do you do hybrid sort of panels, or places that allow people to be in different places and have conversations. So I think that's mostly what I'm excited about, sort of what sort of other ways can we talk to each other besides reading papers to each other. And I guess the freedom, what we're doing now is one of the options, right? That we can have a conversation and share it with folks later. So I'm excited about that.
So it's just, oh, you might go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say for me, the call for papers was so exciting. And at the time though, I wanted actually to be more of a spectator than a participant. I wanted to kind of go and to like revel in what was going on. I think particularly in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of a series of different things, personal and political, I was really excited to kind of just enjoy the company of fellow academics and see how folks were taking up the call. And sadly, I won't be able to be at ASA. I had a death in the family. My grandmother passed away and just recently, and so I'll have to go to Puerto Rico. So I'll be missing the ASA. So then my goal of being there and watching and just wanting to engage earnestly in what other folks were doing won't come into fruition. But we do have this and the series of these courses and other ways for me to participate. And I just know that it's going to be a beautiful conference. I think people are so excited to be able to come back together and to do so in New Orleans, which is so much historical and contemporary significance for so many of us. I think it's going to be fantastic. So.
Marisol, you were about to say something. Yomara, we're so sorry for your loss, and we're going to be very sad to miss you in person, but we're glad that you can be with your family.
I was just gonna say, I just came off of my first conference in person after the pandemic. We had the Puerto Rican Studies Association conference last week, and I think I underestimated how moving it is to be in community again, and to be with people. And I think the stuff that you might have was talking about, right? The shooting shit in the hallway, or the parties or whatever, not just the panels, right? But also the panels as a space for exchange and connection, and feeling ignited, right? And sparked by the what people are doing and talking about and stuff. And so I'm really actually looking forward to that, I think. And still have to write my paper and all of that stuff, but I'm just really, I think, thrilled to just see people again, right? And I think a lot of us feel that way, right? The just the coming together is the goal, right? in this really like beautiful way.
Pablo.
Yes, sorry about that earlier. My finger wasn't fast enough to unmute. I want to just echo that I'm very much looking forward to the gathering, to just be in the space. This is my first time going to ASA as a non-grad student, right? And I've been used to going to American Studies Association as a grad student. And ASA always felt like this amazing place of like a super duper graduate seminar. I'm excited to be in conversation as in a different capacity, as a colleague. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing folks I haven't seen in a minute. Like, just to keep it real, like I feel like the pandemic really shut us off from each other. Email and FaceTime is not enough. So I'm looking forward to it. And a big hug, Yomaida, a big hug.
And like all of you, I'm looking forward to getting together, the conviviality. I do think that just to bring it back to the CFP, one of the things that I was most excited by was the invocation of music and the invitation for there to be music and musicality in our approach to our work and to our politics and to our gatherings. And as someone who actually met Shauna in those areas and like first convened with Shauna in those areas, I think it's a wonderful way of, kind of coming full circle to the different ways we may have felt outside of or not belonging to the academy. It may have been our way of bonding on the fringes of what our institutional experiences were. And now to see that spirit be centered or have an opportunity to be a kind of starting point or focal point that can radiate outwards in these different ways, that really, it's very moving. And I'm so excited about that, and of breaking bread with everyone, breaking many kinds of bread with everyone as we travel, and enjoy also the different things that New Orleans has to offer around gathering and being together and being outside, etc. So, and I look forward to seeing some of you there in person, even if we don't get the pleasure of Yomaida with us in New Orleans. So on that note, I think we'll wrap it up since we've been going for about an hour. Thank you all for spending the afternoon together and for considering the CFP. Thanks to Shauna Redmond for gathering us in many respects and in multiple respects, both here and obviously also in New Orleans. And we'll see you in a couple of days. Thanks, everyone.
Y'all better tear it up. Bye.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone in New Orleans.
Yes, peace.